Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the fact that monopolies are not always monopolies, or what we call contestable markets. Contestable markets. And the point is here is just because you see a monopoly in reality does not mean that monopoly has a whole lot of market power. It must have some, but it doesn't have to have a whole lot. Okay? So suppose you've got a market that's a relatively small natural monopoly. It's got some barrier to entry, but it's not huge. Roughly speaking, my market power is proportional to the size of the barrier to entry. If there's some barrier to entry, I still have some market power, because I could always price above marginal cost by a penny, and no one would dare enter. But I only have market power up to the size of those barriers to entry. I can't massively overprice, or folks will enter. Okay? So basically, the idea in contestable markets is a monopolist facing threats. That it's only one provider, but there's always the threat that more people can enter. And so while you see the monopoly say, oh, they must have massive market power, just because it's a monopoly doesn't mean they're not always facing a threat of entry. As long as their barrier to entry isn't too big, it's not like a water utility, then there's always the threat of entry. We call that a contestable market. A contestable market is a monopoly market with the threat of entry. A monopoly market with the threat of entry. Okay? And the most famous example of this comes in the case of airlines. Now, when commercial flight became a big industry, in the post-war years, the view was that this was a natural monopoly. Building planes was expensive. It was hard to sort of run an airline. And the view was this is a natural monopoly. So what we're going to do is we're going to regulate it. So for the US post-war history, airlines were regulated. So when I was a kid, okay, airlines would apply to fly different routes. The governments would tell them what route they could fly, and the government would tell them what price they could charge. Okay? It was generally assumed by economists that the government was doing a lousy job of this. And in particular, the opposite problem of the one I suggested before, the government was setting the price too high. That there was a lot of inefficiency in this industry, firms are sort of lying about what their costs were, and there's a lot of inefficiency, and we could really create a large social welfare gain if we deregulated airlines, because economists were convinced this was a contestable market. Economists said, you're wrong, government. This is not a natural monopoly with a huge fixed barrier to entry. In fact, it's not that expensive to build a plane, in particular, even to buy a used plane. Okay? This is a pretty contestable market. And if we deregulate, there'll be a lot of new entry, driving prices down and increasing social welfare. And the economists actually won. One of the great victories of economic policy. In 1978, airlines were deregulated. Okay? So what happened? A few things happened. First, prices came way down. Prices fell by about 1/3 on average. Economists were right. This was way overpriced. The best example is when I was in college and airlines were still relatively newly deregulated, there was an airline called People's Express, which I flew home to Newark Airport for $29 each way. $29. People's Express sucked. People's Express, it was like you didn't even pay on the ground, you paid in the air. You just showed up, there were no reservations. You showed up, you lined up, X people got on, the flight left, and then the next people got on the next flight. And then you paid, the cart went down the aisle, and you paid in the air. I never knew what happened if someone didn't have money. Like they throw them out of the plane. I never knew how that worked. I always made sure I had my money. But it was that, and flew for $29 each way. Prices came way down. The second thing that happened was there were many more routes offered. The regulators had assumed you can only fly from here to here economically. But in fact, they were wrong. There was all these cool ways airlines could fly economically the regulators didn't think were possible. And once you allowed the airlines to innovate through deregulation, they innovated and found all these cool ways to fly around the country. So consumers had more routes to choose from at lower prices. Okay? The third thing that happened is quality of airline massively deteriorated. You guys have no idea what it's like to fly nice. Okay? You guys see Mad Men. That's what it was like to fly. You'd go on, there'd be plenty of space, there'd be tons of food and booze. The staff was super nice to you. There was no line. It was wonderful. Okay? Flying now sucks, right? We know that. Okay? Unless you're some fancy businessman. Okay? Flying sucks, and people hate about it. People hate that about flying. Why did this happen? Why did quality deteriorate so much when we deregulated airlines? Why economists, in fact, expected this would happen? Why did this happen? Yeah? Well, that's sort of a symptom, that's sort of an end result of what happened. Why was quality so high before? Yeah?
Well, when it's so expensive and there's so few people flying, it's really easy to provide a really quality flying experience. But when you have a lot more people flying...
No, but hold on one second. I'm a monopoly airline, or I'm one of several airlines. You're saying I can make a lot of money, so I'm going to spend it on good quality. Why? Why not just keep the money? Why have the quality be good? Yeah?
Instead of platform costs, people chose based on quality.
Because that was the only way you could compete before. Competition always happens, people. It's just that before, the government wouldn't let that competition happen on price. So instead, it happened on quality. So as my price was capped by the government, but I was making shitloads of money, I said, I'll provide a great flying experience to try to get people to come to my airline. So the way airlines competed, they didn't run ads with prices before. They ran ads with amenities. That's how airlines competed. So essentially what we've done is we replaced quality competition with price competition. Okay? We replaced quality competition with price. Now, not total quality. In fact, safety is no lower than it was. Safety is actually a bit higher. So we didn't let quality deteriorate on safety. That's still regulated quite heavily, and that's, if anything, higher than it was before. I mean, all the amenities. So basically went from a world where they competed on amenities to where they compete on price. How do we know that's a better world to be in? How do we know that we are better off with cheap, crappy flights? Yeah?
Surpluses.
What's that?
Higher surpluses. Like
Well, I mean, we don't measure surpluses. Give me a more real-world answer. Give me a more real-world answer. How do we know? Yeah?
The number of people who fly.
Well, the number of people flies up, the population's up, the economy's growing. What else? If this was not true, imagine you're an airline, and imagine I was wrong, that people would rather have higher quality flights at a higher price. What would you do?
The market would reflect that.
Yeah, there'd be a new airline called We Don't Suck. And they would charge the old price and provide the old quality. That doesn't exist. Now, JetBlue is sort of moving a bit in that direction. Okay, it's a slightly better flying experience for slightly more money. But there's nothing that's like the old flying experience at the old prices. So what's ironic here is everybody bitches about how bad flying is. They don't bitch about how low the prices are. Okay? So basically, we've made a decision as a society. What deregulation did was let the consumer choose what they wanted. If the consumers really liked the old quality at high prices, it would exist. It doesn't because we didn't really like that. And indeed, everyone who laments, oh, I miss the old days when Don Draper had such a nice flight. Don't forget, Don Draper's secretary couldn't afford to fly. Okay, now Don Draper's flight might not be as nice, but at least his secretary can afford to fly someplace. Okay? And so basically, the point is, we've decided as a society that basically we prefer this. Now, one last point. Lest you think economists are superheroes and we always get everything right, we did miss one thing. This has not been as good as economists anticipated because we missed the fact that there's still a monopoly aspect of flying. And the monopoly aspect we missed is airport gates are still a limited resource. And as a result, what airlines did was set up the hub and spoke system, where what you do is you always have to fly through the airline's hub to get to where you want to go. And airlines dominate these hubs. So as a result, if you have to fly to an airport that's one airline's dominated hub, then you pay a lot of money. Now, less than you would have paid before. But the bottom line is what we missed is that, yes, the airlines themselves are contestable markets, but the airports are not, because the airport slots are limited. So the monopoly aspect that remains the airport gates. And as a result, while this has lowered prices tremendously to airports where there's lots of competition, it's not lowered to airports where airlines take over and make it their hub. So if you fly to Salt Lake City, as I've had to do a number of times, it is 3 times as much as flying to San Francisco. Okay, that makes no sense. It's a lot closer to Boston and San Francisco. But it's because Delta owns Salt Lake City. Okay, where San Francisco Airport has a number of competitors. That's the thing economists missed. We missed the fact that there's still a natural monopoly aspect, which is airports. So it's not as good as we would have hoped, but still a lot better than it was. Okay, let's stop there, and we'll come back on Wednesday and talk about my favorite word, oligopoly.